Our next speaker is Tim Britton. Tim is responsible for the open research portfolio across Springer Nature. Previously was the head of strategy and transformation for PwC's Global Data Research and Insight Center. And before that, he spent a long time as a CEO and European Chief Operating Officer of YouGov. And he's going to tell us about conflict. What conflict? And where open science meets commercial interest.
I am indeed. Thank you very much indeed. I'm talking about open as insofar as it relates to scientific communication. So I'm here as a publisher. I'm here as a for-profit publisher. I'm quite new, as the introduction I've been kindly given there, into the world of academic publishing. I joined 2 years ago. And I quickly came to realise it's quite important to do two things. You introduce whether you're profit or not-for-profit, and you give your subject matter pretty quickly, and often the institution from which you came. So I'm a for-profit publisher, and I did a philosophy degree. So what on earth qualifies me to be on this stage, one might ask oneself. But what's interesting to me, and what drives me, what excites me, is about making the work that is done usable, reusable, because until it gets out there, to put it very simply, all of the work as we've just been talking about, until it becomes a practical application, I'm not saying there's no point to pure work, that's not where I'm going here, but until people are able to share and build upon the work that's being done, there is arguably no value to it. Now, in terms of what that means for where open science meets commercial interests and a for-profit publisher or not, it's quite often assumed that there is this tension between being open and not being open, that there's an incompatibility between open access models and subscription business models from a publishing point of view, and that hybrid journals are somehow a barrier to openness. Hybrid, just in case, I know we've got quite a diverse audience, so hybrid here is the ability to have an open access article within a subscription or behind a paywall journal. So the hybrid open access, the open articles are fully open, the subscription articles remain open to the only to be consumed if you've got a subscription to it. And then there's this kind of breathless talk sometimes about the tensions between the universities and the publishers and the funders, and how we're going to get that sorted out. And I think from what's interested me so much in coming into this industry is sometimes the ideological stances that can be taken about this, the kind of the open good, subscription bad, the non-profit versus profit and all of that. Whereas actually, if we come down to focus on what it is that matters, how can we best communicate, how can we best make sure that something can be found and therefore reused, if we can put in something in place that is most usable to the scientific community, that for me is where the value lies. So what I'd like to do this evening is talk a little bit about what we do within Springer Nature to make our work as open as possible. I'd like to talk a little bit about why it's complicated. I'd like to suggest that actually there is value in subscription journals and that they have a role to play too, not necessarily forever, but right now they do. And in the recent and kind of talk from an announcement from Plan S around hybrid, it would be impolite of me not to address that. And to give a sneak peek on that, we think that hybrid can be a good thing and can be a force for good and is not necessarily a barrier. But I'll come on to that. And lastly, but by no means least, I'd like to come on to what I really think the opportunity is for open science, which is in the field of open data and the role that publishing might be able to play in that. So, we're a commercial publisher. What do we do with... Oh, are we going to move on? Yep, we are going to move on. So, at Springer Nature, we do a lot of open publishing. We've got over 600, just under 600 fully open access journals. Last year published 90,000 fully open access, and I'm talking about gold OA here, so it's immediately open to all, no restrictions on a CC BY license, so can be reused without restriction as long as they're credited. But most importantly for me, as it was saying up there, in the 4 European countries where we have deals, compact deals as they're called, with funders, we publish a very, very, very high percentage of our work as open access. That in Sweden, 90% of all of the work that is published by Springer Nature is fully open access. In the UK, it's 77%, in Austria, it's 73%, in the Netherlands, it's 84%. The point being is commercial publishers can, with the right collaboration between funders and institutions, we can make open work. The question is, how can we all do that? But it does take a number of different parties in order to do it. We also, with our Shared It tool, have something that enables researchers to share their research in a fully readable form the moment that it's published, whether it's in a subscription journal or not. So we're enabling the passing round of the work that people have done. So, and I should have introduced myself slightly more fully, actually. My job title at Springer Nature is the Managing Director for the Open Research Group. And what that means is that I have responsibility for all things relating to open science. And the reason I make that point is not to say that I've got a fancy job title, because that doesn't really matter very much. But what does matter is that we can put together the resources that relates to open science. And as I keep coming back to it, as a commercial publishing house, we put a lot of effort into making our work as open, or sorry, the work that is done by the community, as open as it can. But, and this is a really big but, subscription is the prevailing business model, the prevailing way that scientific communication is shared, and that is the reality within which we're working. There has been open access as a strong force for over 20 years. So I think it was, BMC was founded in 99, maybe 2000, PLOS was what, 2001, 2002, something like that. So, you know, we are been around for a good long time now, but it really is still a relatively small proportion of all of the academic output which is published remains open access. And so there is still a long way to go. And there is good reason behind that, insofar as it isn't just about, when people are choosing where to go, it is about the community that is right for the work that has been done. It is about making sure that the right people are going to read it, they're going to see it, they're going to notice it, and that it's shared. And if that journal or if that environment is a subscription journal or environment, then authors are making a legitimate choice to publish there. And to be clear, I'm not here saying that it is the academic freedom. You have the right to publish anywhere. It's slightly different debate. But the point I'm making is that for reasons of effective communication, authors are quite reasonably choosing where to publish, and that doesn't always mean publishing open access. The other reason why the subscription model, the paywall, is still there to some degree, is about selectivity. Publishing in a journal such as Nature or Science, it's a really expensive thing to do because of the amount of work, the rejection rate. It's the work that's done into the manuscripts that don't get published. It's 1% of all submissions into Nature end up getting published. It's a lot of editorial effort to go through the other 99%. Now, we're not averse to trying to make that open. It's just on the APC model, so the article processing charge for the highly selective journals would make them extremely expensive. We've also got the issue that some disciplines are more open friendly than others. And I've also just realised that the screen is just in the way. So there's another point down here, which I'll read. And that globally, the picture's also mixed. And I think this is quite important. We're here at the Crick in London, which is kind of up there when it comes to attitudes to openness. When you're talking about being biomedical, when you're talking about being in Northern Europe, the prevailing winds are very strongly and very positively behind open access. But when you look at the picture more globally, it is a lot more fragmented than that. So the map that we're seeing up here is showing the the different policy frameworks that we're looking at. So the orange parts are showing where there's a strong OA mandate, where there's open access funding available. The green is showing, unsurprisingly, where it's a more green self-archiving environment. And then the kind of the OA mandate, as we're seeing in North America, where there are some institutions and some funding bodies, and Gates being a very obvious example, which are kind of strongly OA, but there isn't a kind of a national picture. And the importance behind this is that we're a publisher that operates in a global environment. We are serving communities that have different levels of access to funding, and we are serving communities that are inhabiting in different parts of the world. And so what we're doing is we are servicing the needs as best we can in those different areas. As I say, we try where we can. We put a lot of open options on the table. It is always possible to publish in an open environment. And to be clear, in our journals, if you don't have access to funding, we have our policy, our waiver policy, is that no article is turned down on the ability to pay. If there is no funding available, then we waive the fee and it's published. However, the driver behind the scientific publishing activity in different parts of the world does differ tremendously, and we have to take that into account. Which leads me on to the hybrid journals in terms of their role in helping us to deliver open access. We published a report last year, might have been this year, anyway, very recently, which shows that where we've got the deals, and I'm referring back to here about the compact, so where we're operating in the UK, where we saw earlier, there's 77% of all of the work that is published is done so on an open basis. The change that we saw before and after that deal is enabling people to publish in the subscription portfolios. So we saw 47%. Which are now published gold OA, 47% are gold OA journals, but half, just slightly more than half, 53% of all of those articles have been published in our subscription journals. When I go back to the discipline point, back in 2013 in humanities, you've got high-ish single digits, 8, 9, 10, 11% of all articles in humanities and social sciences being published OA, jumping to way over 50% after the deal had come in. And so without these hybrid journals, we wouldn't have that opportunity to allow those authors to publish. And I think more importantly, there would be an element from kind of from a funding efficiency point of view. If we could only have fully open access journals, then we would end up in a situation of having to launch more of them in order to meet that demand. So for me, on the hybrid question and the subscription journal question versus open access is, given my job, given what we do, given the volume that of our communication that is fully open access, we're really committed to making the science as openly accessible as we can. But we are working with an environment that at the moment means that we have to use a number of different channels. And if we're going to get beyond that, which we are, and great progress is being made in terms of how the transition can be done, it is a collaborative approach that's needed. It is the funders needing to come together with the publishers needing to come up together with the institutions and indeed the authors who are willing to publish OA, and of course a publisher with a full range of options that is going to make this work. But there isn't a simple jump from being having a portfolio of journals on a subscription model and taking them into an open access model. However, when you do make that switch and you do get the funding lined up and you do get people bought into it, you make open happen. 90% plus in Sweden is the living proof that it can be made to happen. And that's the exciting part of what we're doing, and that's what we're focusing on. So that's the journal publishing side of things. But from my point of view, from our point of view, it starts getting really interesting when we're talking about open and sharing, because as the slide is saying up there, that the real revolution isn't about open access from a publishing point of view, it's about truly the ability to share. The flip from OA into the slip from subscription into OA is changing a model of publishing. It's changing a way of sharing. It isn't changing the way that research is actually done. It gets much more exciting when we're talking about the role that can be played within sharing open data. And this is what can truly change the... sorry, pausing there, is it? No, it's not going to come up on the screen. When we can share the data more fully, to enable, as we've been talking about a little bit earlier, enhances reproducibility, increases the efficiency of funding, makes work much more interesting because we don't have to keep on repeating the null results. We can build upon the work that's already been done. We don't have to keep on doing them time and time again. And we get the unintended benefits of sharing data. We've seen a couple here today. If you haven't seen it, I'd urge you to have a look at a site called Study for Forest. Studyforforest.org. Somebody, goodness knows why or who, I'm sure there's an excellent story behind it, did a series of brain imaging maps of people watching the movie Forrest Gump. So you can see through in series how people's kind of brain states are changing as we go along the way. And when you look at some of the case studies in there, and this is what I love about it, there are examples in there about some medical applications, maybe chocolates, who knows, all of the way through to a media company that's understanding what the motivation was for either a particular music or particular thing and how somebody feel. And it's that kind of serendipitous stuff where we can really make a difference. And that's when the openness that we've been talking about here has a much bigger impact on society. The role that I think there is for publishers here is to help people share that data potentially. This is some work we did earlier. There's a reference up there, and we'll be sharing these afterwards, as we said, is that lots of people talk about sharing data and the importance of sharing data. Lots of people say they share data. We found about 64% of people said that they share the data from their experiments. What they actually mean is they might have put some supplementary materials up, and if you email them, they might have a rifle round through their desk and see if they can find some data that they can share with you. What is quite shocking, in my opinion, is actually the state that the data is oftentimes in. So going to the point, just by putting something up doesn't actually make it useful if it is not properly defined, if it's not easy to find, if you don't have the correct metadata surrounding it, if you don't have an idea of how it was originally collected, then it's not going to be a useful thing to do. And what this means is we need firstly policy and thought leadership about why it is, what's important and making sure people do it, but also offering practical support. And I give examples of that. One of the data support services that we're offering to support publication. And we've recently announced a pilot that we're doing with Wellcome in this regard that's offering a data support service for any Wellcome-funded scientist. One of the checks that our data support service offers is, can you open the file? One of the other checks is, does the file have a name? You know, we are not talking rocket science here in lots of cases. And I think it's shocking, actually. The quality of the underlying data, I'm not talking about the quality of the collected data, but the quality of the structure and the way it's collected is in and of itself a barrier to the sharing. And it is our view as a publisher that we have a role that we can play here, not because we want to publish the data, not because we want the IP of the data. The data can go into whichever depository you like, as long as it meets the criteria for longevity and all of that good stuff. But what we can do is put the things in place that can help people share it, that can make it findable, that can make it interoperable, and that can make it reusable. So I'm going to end on that note, insofar as to say that as a publisher who wants to support the overall cause of advancing discovery, we can make the articles more open and more reusable, but I think more importantly, in the longer term, we can make the underlying data more findable and therefore reusable. And that's when we truly get into the efficiency and transformation of science, because we don't have to repeat the same work, we don't have to follow the same blind alleys, and we can find those Forrest Gump examples that we weren't necessarily expecting to stumble across. Thank you.
Thanks for one very interesting presentation. regarding sharing data, we all love to share our data of successful experiments.
Yeah.
Nobody is sharing any data, and I'm talking as a chemist, of an unsuccessful experiment, because it's embarrassing. We don't do that. But it would save quite a lot of time if we say, okay, we tried this experiment, these parameters, it doesn't work. The next problem is, how do I make sure that the data is searchable? You quite heavily touched that area. I was looking into that, talking from the IT point of view a few time ago. And I think what we really need to do, we really need to educate researchers. As soon as you generate data, you look at it, do you need it, yes or no? I need it, I put metadata on it, and I put it in my local archive. So over time, I all build it up. At the end of the day, I say, okay, I need these experiments, I get a DOI, and it's all done.
Yes, I agree. I think the two points there. The null findings thing, I think, is really important because it's a change in mindset and psychology. But as a funder, the amount of money that is, I don't know what the numbers are, but there must be an extraordinarily large sum of money spent on null findings. And if we didn't have to spend the money again to find someone else having the same null finding, it really does change things dramatically. So I think partly there's a psychology, there's an allowability of it. To put it in really crude terms, I know that we're coming on to a little bit about researcher incentives in a moment, but to put really crudely, you've got a null finding, you can put it up, you get a DOI, it counts, right? Might not necessarily be that highly cited, but it doesn't stop it being valuable, and it doesn't stop there being something in it for yourself. But what this really comes down to is the culture of it, and that's a really long game, and if I'm being very honest about the way that we're approaching things, we recognised quite early on that if we went directly out to individuals in the community, this was going to be quite a hard struggle because people aren't necessarily ready for it, which is why we're partnering with Wellcome and some other organisations to help seed this idea, because I personally believe that, and that's why we've done the thought leadership piece as well, partly it's about getting the message out, partly it's about the policy. People have to do it, they will start doing it. And partly it's about how easy can we make it for people, and that comes to the funding part too. So it isn't simple, We've got to do it.
So why is the open access rate so different in countries by over 20%? Because people actually pay for open access then, or? So in terms of the take-up rates, you mean? Yeah, I mean it's partly about how it's promoted and how much people want to take the option up, and it's partly about the availability of funding. So there's a really clear link that, you know, if it's freely funding available, it's very easy to do, then it will be adopted. And then that comes back again to ultimately the policy of the funder. So if the ultimate funder of the science is pushing it, then it has a greater adoption. If they're not, it doesn't.
What do you think about opening up new journals within Springer Nature, and if there's sort of a way you could then make sure that those are definitely open access? Because I see, of course, you're not going to change Nature to being open access overnight, but if you open new journals within Springer Nature, what would you do?
Yeah, so we do a combination. We do a combination of those things. So we've opened. So the most high-profile launches last year were the communications journals as part of the Nature portfolio, which are fully open access journals. But we also work with a number of partners, by academic societies or institutions, who also have a desire or not to have subscription or not. And actually, and the other area to take into account is whether something is going to be viable or not. And this comes back to the funding question, because there are parts of the landscape which won't support a fully open access journal in the long term. And we have had some examples of a sponsor coming in and they might support it early on. And then as soon as there isn't easy funding available, it becomes much harder to support it. So it comes back actually to the discipline question as well as the question of selectivity.
Thank you. One last question? Okay.
Thank you. So you mentioned that kind of the problem with the kind of pure gold open access model for a journal like Nature would be like this really high cost of publishing because of the high cost of the editorial effort, and that this would be bad because it kind of restricts access to less well-funded researchers. So on this point, I kind of have two questions. One is whether there's any way that we can kind of, I guess, extract more value as a community from all this like editorial effort that's going in by kind of being more open in some way about the outcomes of the review process, and also whether we can distribute this cost more fairly so that it doesn't fall as a huge lump sum on the researcher who does eventually get the Nature stamp of approval, so that it can be kind of more equitable in that way.
Okay. So two quite big questions. So in terms of the kind of the sharing of it and open peer review, I think there's an enormous amount that can be got potentially out of forms of open peer review, and indeed there are clearly platforms out there that have different way, albeit all from preprints all the way through to those that are kind of allowing the publication process itself to be more open and visible as you know, forms of community peer review, transparent and open peer review. So I think there is a lot that can be from the openness of peer review reports, to take an example. There is more value that can be taken from that. As always, there's counter-arguments in terms of people's willingness to be open, the freedom to be able to objectively report if these things are going to be open. So again, it isn't just as simple as saying, make it open. And in the BMC portfolio, we've had a long-held commitment to various different forms of open peer review, but we also do find that in fully open peer review journals, it is more challenging to find reviewers that are willing to do that, and that slows down the communication. As we've heard earlier about speed of reporting, so on, and speed of openness also. So there are balances, but the overall point I would make is if we can be more open and transparent as part of that process, there's definitely more that can be taken, value that can be extracted, to use your language. On the point of spreading the cost, it's hard. So people have discussed the idea of subscription. Paying a submission fee rather than a publication fee, which is one way of spreading it all out. And there are, and you know, we won't surprise you to know, we've looked at a range of different options for that. And if I just take that in relation to Nature, the submission fee in and of itself, it wouldn't be insubstantial, and that's one thing. You end up having to collect a huge amount of small payments from a lot of different people, which is challenging in and of itself. It's a practical problem that could ultimately be solved, of course, but you know, there's real challenges behind that. And there's also a moral question behind that, as a colleague of mine put it, that it can become a tax on hope, because they get a lot of people submitting that ain't never going to get into Nature, and whether it's right for them to be charged or not, I don't know. So it isn't that it is impossible, but where we are right now, in the system that we have set up and within the funding environment that we are, it will be extremely challenging.